Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very nice to be here in Arklow with a traditional storm last night, which is nice to see the Irish weather doesn't change too much. So I don't need to introduce myself in some respects because you've very kindly done it for me, but I think what it's interesting to think about is that 1998, the Arklow Offshore project was being developed and thought about, and by 2004 we were building offshore wind in the UK and here in Arklow Banks. Today I'm working on the commercial bids for the UK CFD3 projects, which is probably around 9 gigawatts of projects that we're looking at. So I think what I'd like to do today is just touch on Arklow Bank, which is what I'm here to really talk to you a little bit about. And then I think that 15-year journey as to what's been happening in the UK and globally, the trend towards bigger turbines, why that's happening, and perhaps a little bit about the GE 12 megawatt turbine. So I think really from the point of view of being able to leverage and leapfrog, I think that's the story really. So in the last 15 years, what we've seen in Ireland is a number of really great projects in great location with great resources. We've seen the LCOE fall by probably a third globally. So how do we develop and deliver that and utilise that, I think, here in Ireland? And some of the details that perhaps we've worked on in other markets, for example, around marine Coast Guard agency engagement, leisure fishing, fisheries, leisure yachting, for example, a lot of the myriad of small regulatory developments that we've seen could really be used here in Ireland to assist in developing the headline policy and the regulatory framework that's needed. So I think the concept of leapfrogging and leveraging is really one of the key messages that I'd like to share. So in that 15-year period, we've gone from 30 turbine projects in the UK, maybe 80, 90 megawatts, to 1.5 gigawatt size projects. The Crown Estate is on the fourth round, well, preparing for the fourth round of allocating leases during that 15-year period, and we're heading towards a 30 gigawatt target, all driven by competitive power pricing and the LCOE dropping to around a third of where it was when we started. So I think maybe if I just, not very good with technology. There we go. So, quick introduction to GE. Well, it's a tier 1 company within the General Electric company, the General Electric Renewable Energy Company. So the two highlights I would flag up on here are the fact that we have something like, actually, more like 50,000 turbines installed globally, and the LM acquisition. So the LM acquisition really enabled us to work closely with our blade technology engineers to develop the larger rotors, which we see on a 158 megawatt turbine onshore, 158 meter rotor megawatt. It's a 5.3 megawatt turbine, 15 with 158 meter rotor onshore, and then the offshore turbine, which has the 107 meter rotor. Without the LM acquisition, I don't think that would have been achievable. The other point is Predix. So on the right here, 14,000 of our turbines are running on GE's own software platform. So I'll mention that later, but I think it's really quite critical and it underpins where we're going in offshore wind. So Arklow Bank, phase 1. So as we've heard, it is Ireland's only offshore wind farm, co-developed with Airtricity. COD in 2004, it was a fabulous launch ceremony with blue skies and a nice boat and lots of people sailing around the turbines. I think some of you in the room were actually there on the day. It's 7 turbines, as you said at the time, the 3.6 megawatt turbine, one of the largest turbines in the world. That hub height, that rotor diameter, that is now around half of what we're delivering in the 12 megawatt turbine. So 15 years later, we've essentially doubled the physical parameters. We've done more than that with the technology, but the physical parameters have essentially doubled. It's 10 kilometres offshore, which in the context of a Dogger Bank at 150 kilometres doesn't sound very much. It is still a long way offshore in a hostile environment, as our service team can tell you. And in fact, some of our service team is here today, and they've been with the project since 2003. So it's a quick introduction to Arklow, and we thought it would be perhaps interesting in the context of 15-year lifetime of the project to talk about some of the things that we've learned. Clearly, much bigger projects in other markets have learned the same lessons, but at the time for us, I think health and safety was one of the critical things. There were no operating procedures, there were no regulations as to what you do and how you do to keep your people safe. So one of the things, in addition to sort of training protocols and minimum sizes of teams, etc., have been regular engagement and drills with the local emergency services. So with the Irish Coast Guard, for example, one of the things I think where we've set best practice, particularly in terms of maintaining that level of safety that you have to have, is that regular engagement. And again, that is something that will underpin what you do as an industry here in Ireland, in addition to leveraging other procedures from other countries. Wind speeds and wave heights. Now, I'm a sailor, so for me, empirically, the Irish Sea is just rougher. It's the seasonality, obviously, but the high wind speeds and the wave heights, the wave regime, I mean, this is all coming in off the Atlantic with a great fetch, which in itself should not be a surprise. However, when you're first developing your access solution, which we did, we had a red river barge with a one-eyed first mate, and let's just say by working, and in fact, the guys told me this morning, they were actually sited on the rear deck with patio furniture in terms of arranging the initial access. So it wasn't great. We worked with Neil Clarkson and we developed the Windcat on the Arklow project, which was also required due to the shallow depth on the bank at times because of the cyclical nature of the sandbank. So we developed the Windcat and we improved access from about 30% of the time to 80% of the time. So that was one of the very early learning curves. Here it is, we can't get to it. I think in terms of heavy lift vessels as well, and the jack-up barges, which you do need occasionally. We would like to think we don't need to be there when we don't want to, but we do. Again, I think the water depth, the types of vessels that you're using, the contracting strategies, save your repair until you can get something in that you want to do 2 or 3 jobs. It's all about timing and about availability on the spot market. Again, these were things that we had to learn at the University of Arklow. Cable routing and burial, sandbanks. Everybody loved a sandbank in 2003. So you avoid navigation channels, you theoretically have a nice stable platform to work on, but the cyclical nature and the lateral horizontal movement of sandbanks typically means you get a lot of variation. So you get a lot of scour as well, you typically have a lot of sediment movement. So those sorts of things do impact your cable routing, design and burial. You might choose to stay where you're going to stay, but you really have to consider that. So when the sandbank moves vertically and you lose depth, basically, and we have a lot of, I think, site investigation experts here, but when you have cables spanning and you have cables that are essentially being scoured out because the depth of the water is changing because the sand is falling, then you have a problem. So you either remediate or you design in the extra additional length, the scour pits, the cable protections. So again, this was all a big learning curve for us. The export cable route. You can design your cable route, you can do your site identification, and you find you might have some very hard soils and you might not achieve your 2-metre burial depth. Now, what we learned on Arklow is that it's sometimes okay to just leave the cable on the seabed in areas where it's difficult to install. But on Arklow in 2005, a vessel in a significant storm event clearly didn't want to be where it was, dragged anchor and broke our cable. So that took around 4 weeks for us to find a high voltage splice, the right vessel, find the ends of the cables, pick them up, splice them together. So again, another learning curve. Have the spares, have the, if you have exposed cables, have the spares, have the solutions on tap, ready to deploy. Corrosion protection was a big issue for the industry in general. I think some of the early corrosion protection solutions were let's just say, not sufficient for the environments that the transition pieces were placed in. That has been resolved, but a lot of the remediation work led to I think a collective understanding in the industry that you can't just drive a supplier out of business because you have got, let's just say, 200 transition pieces that need attention. So developing the solutions and the remediation was an important learning point for us. The last 2 points are specific to Arklow, but supply chain engagement. We, from my understanding is, we spend north of 500k in the Leinster area just on services and products to support the ongoing operations and maintenance of a 7-turbine project. In addition, the training, the skills development, our team has been with us for 15 years. But when we need to bring in people for specific scheduled or unscheduled maintenance, then we do have to bring people in because we don't necessarily have the offshore trained personnel with the right skill set. So from an Irish opportunity perspective, 3.5, 5 gigawatts in the future, you have to multiply that up and make the case, you know, as David discussed. There's a significant opportunity here for SK Island PLC. Oops, no, not that one. Okay. So I deliberately didn't talk about targets and forecasting and volume of markets because we have, you know, many people here that know more about this than I do. But I think the point is the trend globally is only going upwards. So the annual, and these are not GE slides, forecasts, they're not mine, it's BNEF and Wind Europe, but the key message is the trend is only set to continue. So offshore wind farms due to double in the 20s. In the UK, we're on track for a 30 gigawatt installation by 2030. And to reiterate the point, that's only going to happen in the UK because of the recent policy certainty. And even that's not dead certain, but the fact is they have, the government has announced that there will be another 3 rounds of CFD. They've even talked about how they will spread that 577 million across the piece. There are still some details to be confirmed, but having a 10-year policy horizon means that developers, operators, manufacturers have a lot more confidence in their ability to stay there for the medium-long term. And that's a relatively new thing. In the UK, the ROCs were never really quite certain where it would go, how it would reduce. But this, at this time, in a way, capitalising on the 12 gigawatts already deployed, whether in, you know, operational or financial close construction, is the trend that we're seeing in the UK, and that's replicated globally. Ireland features in the Wind Europe forecast here. It's quite a small little chunk here, but, you know, consistent with what we're talking about, 3.5 to 5 gigawatts within the next 5 to 10 years. And again, in terms of the pioneering markets, you know, Ireland's featuring in here. And I think the point is, I just say again, leverage and leapfrog. What you have an opportunity to do is to work with the fact that LCOE's, levelised cost of electricity, has fallen to pretty much a third of what it was when we started Arklow Offshore Wind, or, you know, Crown Estate Round 1 in the UK. You have the opportunity to use that and leverage that, but government needs to set the regulatory framework. I mean, I know I'm preaching to the converted, all these nice people here very interested in offshore wind, but there are lots and lots of practical examples and lots of pieces of work that have already been done and lots of experience that you can bring to bear to sort of to make this happen and to make it happen much faster than it happened elsewhere. So this leads neatly into the fact that turbine sizes will continue to increase. As the levelised cost of electricity comes down, what needs to change? The BOP, the turbine cost, all of these good things need to feature. You can't just keep putting more metal in the turbine and making it bigger. It has to get cleverer. There has to be technology shifts, which mean that you're more efficient, otherwise you're not increasing value while you're increasing cost. So turbines are getting bigger, which leads neatly into the GE 12 megawatt turbine. I'll go on to my next page of this. So GE has been working on the 6 megawatt Haliade turbine for some years. We've just installed 66 of the 6 megawatt turbines in Germany on the Mercure project. We installed 5 turbines on the East Coast US, which is interesting because they have to come from Europe on a vessel to be installed because of the Jones Act in the US, which restricts construction activity, which is something the US needs to work on. So we've just built 3 units in China, the 6 megawatt platform. So the 12 megawatt platform has been under development for the last 3 years, and we are deploying the first prototype next year, middle of 2019. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it. Not too much, because I'm not very technical. We have a nice picture here. It's quite square, very large. And the overall headlines on the size of the turbine, and this is the platform. It's 12 megawatt capacity. It's 107 metre long blades. Now, we were at the recent wind conference in, say, Hamburg. I think it was Hamburg. And we had a banner up which stretched the length of the exhibition hall, which was 107 metres long. Now, I don't think you can't really visualise 107 metre long blade. Well, I can't anyway. And but just seeing that makes you realise the size and the implications for the balance of plant. But I'll talk a little bit about that. And I think the key point for me is the gross AEP and the capacity factor, which is why we're getting bigger and cleverer with the turbines. So 67 gigawatt hours gross AEP, which is a 63% capacity factor. Now, that's actually based on a typical North Sea project, around 10 metres per second, 100 metres hub height. The Irish Sea's got more than that. So the sorts of capacity factors we would expect to see just using this 12 megawatt turbine will be higher than that. So when it comes to permitting, and I've had this discussion with a number of customers, how big do you go right now? What do you look at for an environmental impact assessment? How do you future-proof where you're going to go? It's a difficult question when today we're around 10 megawatt, heading to 12, heading to 15, and then who knows? But I think it's an important consideration. And I think the other point on this is around and perhaps I think you can probably read that. Some nice, interesting information, but it's essentially double the 6 megawatt turbine. I think the capacity factor leads to a discussion around future-proofing. So at the moment, we're looking at a RES system here, with CFDs in the UK, tax incentives, various feed-in tariffs around the world. But going forward, it's likely that some markets will move to merchant. We're already seeing, for example, in Holland, some of the projects there that are being developed are merchant. Now, in this sort of scenario where you are merchant, this higher level of production that's possible at lower wind speeds is critical, because it means that you're paying the power price. So when the wind speed is high, if you've got a high penetration of renewables or a limited grid, Ireland, then, and you're in a merchant scenario, your power prices are higher, of course, when you've got lower wind speed. And that's the beauty of a turbine like this, where you get more power at the lower wind speeds because of the higher capacity factor. So it's not relevant perhaps today, but we have support mechanisms in place. But in a merchant market, it's definitely going to be a big issue. When we talk about balance of plant, if you think about, you have less turbines given let's call it a grid constrained site rather than a land constraint or a sea constrained site, then the balance of plant cost, you have less turbines, so you have less sticks or jackets in the ground. And in that sense, it then becomes a case of, well, how much more does it cost for your jacket or your foundation, because your loads are going to be bigger on a 12, 15 megawatt turbine than they would be on a 10 megawatt turbine. So there's some extremely clever people working on all sorts of foundation loads management, control systems, and I think that's a space where we're really seeing value add. So there's a price for the turbine, and then there's a view on the residual 50% capex. How do you get smarter on those levers? And that's a whole space. Let's call it the value buckets, the value levers. That's where the majority of the bids that I'm engaged with, people are starting to scratch their heads and say, well, how do we improve that even further? And this is where, again, LCOE will continue to fall. It's not just in the turbine space. There's a huge focus on those balance of plant issues. And then intelligent wind farm. So I call it stay ashore. And people say, well, you have to go offshore. Well, of course you do. You have to go for the planned maintenance. But ideally, when you're using a really intelligent digital platform, what you should be doing is, well, I guess the first thing is we have a very highly rigorous testing regime. So we've got a 5-year R&D agreement with Aura Catapult. So the 12 megawatt nacelle, one's going out on a demonstration unit next year, one's going straight into Aura Catapult. Same with the blades. So testing to destruction, testing, highly accelerated live tests, all of that good stuff. So you've got to increase reliability. But we've also got a huge amount of redundancy in the turbine. So double cooling systems, for example. You can lose some operability and still keep running. So I think that's a key part of it. But the digital piece is more important, because that will allow you to predict when you down rate to a certain extent, when you plan your maintenance, because you can trend things that are coming, all those good things. But I think more important than that is the robotics and the AI. We should not really be needing to visit these turbines unless it's planned maintenance. And that's a space that we have in the Global Research Centre. So we have all sorts of clever little robots that go inside gas turbine blades and go upside down and go and inspect things and fix things and talk things. I don't even know what it's called, but I think people sell them nowadays when you put a thingy on and you put some gloves on and you don't have to actually put your hands on the wheels that you're turning. We have all this technology. So this is all being built into the service programming maintenance for this sort of turbine, where we would really hope not to be going offshore at all.